Alrighty, it is 2 o'clock, and in interest of people who were able to us exactly at 2, why don't we go ahead and get started? Bruce, Kevin, are you ready for the beginning of our webinar?
Ready.
All set.
Great. Well, first, let me welcome everybody. I see some good friends in the attendee list and some new friends, and just encourage you to participate and do whatever you can to ask questions, use the chat box if you'd like. My name is Jeannie Allen. I'm the founder and CEO of the Center for Education Reform, and as well as consumer of Catholic education, and an advocate for any kind of approach it takes to educate our kids. And so I'm really pleased to be able to make this discussion on innovation in online education with an insider and outsider perspective. Joining me, as most of you know, is Kevin Baxter, who's the Chief Innovation Officer at the National Catholic Education Association, also a longtime Catholic school leader around the country. And Bruce Davis, the CEO of Global Scholars, also a veteran of online education and innovation in the EdTech. So welcome, gentlemen, to this conversation.
Thanks, Jeannie.
Thank you, Jeannie.
You're welcome. For those of you just joining us again, please feel free to throw Q&A throughout our discussion. And I'm just so pleased that you're all here, because I think this, as we all know, is their day in the sun for K-12 education, which my guest today, conversation, I think will allude to, is in a paradigm shift. I think all of you probably would agree that 12 and particularly online education has never been more in the limelight, for better or worse. Great stories of heroism and activity and accomplishment dot the newspapers and our social media feeds, and at the same time, tales of really tragic decline and failure among students do as well. So we'd really like to set the stage for what's happening in Catholic school. You look at the research and the data that have been collected around by groups like the Center for Reinventing Education at the University of Washington and others. It appears that post-COVID, during the pandemic, the schools that were most likely to turn on a dime, if you will, those who were able to respond quickly, were in the category of sort of smaller, more nimble schools, including Catholic schools. And so we want to get into a conversation about, is that really the case, and why that's happening, and what the prospects for are in the future for online Catholic education, kind of what we need to know in order to be successful during this time, as well as post, because it's what we're learning now. I think you'd all agree has incredible repercussions for them. So let me start with Kevin Baxter. Again, Kevin is the Chief Innovation Officer at the NCEA. And Kevin, we've talked about how, pre-pandemic, there were lots of different blended and different approaches. And post-pandemic, though, Catholic schools seem to be meeting families where they are. Can you talk a little bit about their focus and what you see as, is the glass half full or half empty when it comes to Catholic schools delivering for online learners?
Well, thanks, Jeannie, and it's great to be with you and Bruce today. As with most things, it might be a little bit of a mixed bag. I think pre-COVID, there was a natural shift, and I think my position at NCEA speaks to that, to think about how we can be more innovative within Catholic schools to address the various needs and the various models and the various styles that are out there in the Catholic school landscape. And I think there's a lot of evidence that there was a lot of opportunity in areas like dual language immersion or STEM or blended learning, early childhood. And so there were a lot of areas of focus. One of the areas I was particularly engaged with was micro schools, thinking about how do we create a viable, sustainable Catholic school with low enrollment. And so we can talk more in depth about those if we want. So I think there was a process in place. Then when COVID hit, what we saw, I think, that speaks to Catholic school creativity, innovation, just the incredible work ethic and effort from educators was their response to the shutdown. And again, this has been talked about now for a few months, but really you had Catholic schools shifting to remote instruction over a weekend. They were shutting down on Friday and then having school back up and going on Monday or Tuesday of the next week, really without missing a beat. And in my mind, that spoke to what Catholic schools kind of have in their nature, is that they are always competing for kids. Their history is that they charge for a product that's free down the street. And so there's that mindset in the Catholic educator about, we've got to be responsive. We've got to be open to what our parents want and what our community wants. So I think we saw that shift when COVID first happened. I think, to your point, we're now obviously 7 months in, and there's a wide variety of different things going on around the country. The jury's out on how do we learn from this in ways that will be substantive and impactful after we get on the other side of COVID. And I don't know that we have clear answers on that yet. I've got a lot of thoughts and things I'm thinking about, but in terms of how do we take this incredibly disruptive time that we've gone through and pull out those aspects that we think can be incredibly valuable to hold on to as we move forward in the future. And I think that piece we're still not settled on.
So I want to ask you another question before we move to Bruce that's somewhat related to the innovation piece you're speaking of. What necessitated having a NCEA? When I first heard that there was this position and that you were taking that position, I was like, wow, Chief Innovation Officer, National Catholic Education Association. You don't think about typically NCEA, and there's no disparaging at all, like, wow, Catholic schools tend to be very traditional. Clearly, what you've just described is something completely the opposite of, and clearly NCEA picked up on that even before the pandemic. Why?
It's a great question, and credit Tom Burnford, our former president CEO, who really had the thought to do this. And I think you're right, Jeannie, that NCEA is a very traditional organization in many, many ways, and it's been around for over 100 years, and it's very, in some ways, locked in the way this is how we've always done things. And I think the vision from my position was to and I'm on the West Coast, and I've been on the West Coast. I'm actually at my office here at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, and that's partly intentional, I think, in terms of having kind of almost a dotted line to the organization proper, and thinking about how to kind of come up with these ideas and thoughts without being wrapped up in the organization as a whole. So that was the thought. And I think it was a great thought. And the board of directors had a strategic plan where there were about seven initiatives created. And I had 3 of those under my portfolio to kind of develop some of these products. And so it was a forward thinking move in my mind. COVID and some other things have just been a little bit disruptive in terms of how that has cycled through. But I think we've learned a lot. And I think there's a lot of opportunity, again, as we move forward and get over the hump with regard to COVID-19.
So Bruce, jump in here. How would you help us process through the paradigm shift? I mean, you're an outsider to Catholic, but certainly an insider to the world of innovation, ed tech, and online education. And so what was happening before this that maybe paved the way for responses now? And what do you see happening after that could be helpful for those people who are trying to develop new approaches?
From the broader educational technology standpoint, online learning or distance education or virtual schooling or whatever label you want to put on the use of technology for instruction, and the separation of the teacher and the student when the technology is used physically, is that this has been going on for quite a while. I mean, you can trace it back to the 1950s when Control Data Corporation built an online learning system called Plato. It was used very widely for training in the IT industry. It was primitive by today's standards, but that's kind of the early project. And over time, it's all gotten more sophisticated. And now there are full motion video, virtual reality learning systems, and everything in between. So as a practitioner in the industry that's watched all of this unfold over the last 20 years, I'm saddened in a way to see schools forced online for all the wrong reasons in the form of a pandemic, and having to contend with something that I think people were starting to recognize has value, and where we've seen big successes in the charter school markets, and especially in higher ed now, where even before the pandemic, 30% of college and graduate instruction was done electronically. Um, Schools have had to adapt because of the pandemic need, and often what they've done is try to replicate what they were doing in the classroom using Zoom and Swivel and Google Classrooms, and asking the teachers to go home and make a curriculum and trying to run a schedule similar to what they had been doing before, which is to say replicate the brick experience using the click technology as best you can, spending as little as possible, and I think in many cases hoping that the pandemic will pass and everything will go back to normal. There's an awful lot of that going on with varying degrees of success. What we see less of are folks who understood online learning for its potential as an instructional tool. There's no correct thing, right? Classrooms are not more right than online learning experiences if they're properly designed. They both serve well in their circumstances and in their way. And we could spend a lot of time today on the subtleties of where online learning probably does a slightly better job and where classroom learning does a slightly better job. I think that probably the most important point to make is that there is a right way to go about it, that the science is certainly there. The instructional science has been tested, measured, verified. It can be very good for the students if it's done correctly, and it doesn't have to be viewed as a stopgap. So I often encourage schools that we at Hudson are working with now to think in terms of not surviving COVID, but rather how do I go from being the brick institution that I was into being the hybrid institution that I should be for all the right reasons, and let COVID be the catalyst perhaps that forced us to make some changes, but let the changes be durable changes that are meaningful to the students over the long run, and get the most out of what the technology has to offer, and emerge from the disruption as a better functioning instructional institution. And that certainly is what I would hope for and recommend. The details of how one goes about that are many, however.
And so talk about those details a little bit. I mean, one is that we hear constantly, and I kind of cringe when I hear declarations of, oh my God, remote education, online education is a complete failure. And unless all students are in school, and of course, for most people out there, we all know that means we're all sitting in desks in a row and having someone stand in front of us, we'll never get learning again. And then you have to kind of go through this very complex discussion when you've got their attention for this much, saying, no, it's not online education. It's crisis education, and online education can be good. So talk about kind of what are some of the models you're seeing that we can help people understand, or that you think are the best. So you've mentioned micro schools, and there's the Prendas of the world out there. There's full models, there's micro models, there's hybrids. How can we help people understand how to apply all of those different things to Catholic schools without turning them into having to be business managers or ed people?
Right. Well, the first step is to move on from the emotion of believing that classrooms are good and computers are bad, and having an emotional debate over it. That's not really constructive, nor does anyone think it's right anymore at this point in history. And then I think you begin to ask yourself, what is it that we're attempting to accomplish with these students, and how do we most effectively go about it? You start to then enter a world of sanity in which you can make sense of the two tools, which tools excel at some disparate things. So turning to the technology for a moment, history with K-12 students over a long period of time and suggests that students can learn independently very successfully, and that an online learning system, an online learning curriculum designed for the purpose, I call it an engineered curriculum, can be a very pleasant experience where the student, especially visual learners, are given material that appeals to them, that's more easy to understand. Imagine trying to lecture, about boiling water, trying to explain the separation of the molecule versus showing them a video of the same thing, which is far more intuitive to see and understand. That's just a simple example, but there are things that can be done that are visually appealing, and 70% of learners are visual learners. The curriculum can be developed so that it repeats things when the student doesn't understand it. It's very patient. And so for certain kinds of students, and there are a lot of those, the independent nature of the learning can be very good if the curriculum is developed and the system is evolved in such a way to do that. That's a very different experience from zooming and swiveling a lecturer in a traditional classroom out to a household. The two things really have nothing to do with each other. So online learning has to be viewed just like any other kind of instructional experience based on what it is, whether it's scoped and sequenced and designed for an outcome-driven purpose, or whether it's just slapped together. I think it's sad that unfortunately a lot of what's going on right now has not been very carefully engineered. Having said that, classroom instruction also has its purposes and its things that it does better. It's very difficult to teach performing arts using computers. There's certain kinds of lab experiences that aren't done too well by simple simulation. And then there's leadership and group dynamics and presentation skills and the peer sociology of being in a classroom. We've all talked about flipped classrooms in the past, and a hybrid system works well that way, where the students learn the rote material using the automated learning system, and the classroom time is spent on higher order thinking. So, to oversimplify a subject, that perspective can be made to work well. And whether the student is in class in a physical school half of the time, or a third of the time, or 2/3 of the time, is all a function of broader instructional design. And whether the class is split into online and offline, or whether the student is taking 2 online classes and 3 offline classes, or in classroom experiences, all of these models are currently being used and in various degrees of experimentation with varying degrees of success.
Yeah.
Often it's done just to manage the physical proximity of the student in the COVID circumstances, but I think over time and in the future, we'll see a hybridized form of instruction prevail as a better, more flexible, more complete experience for kids that's durable.
I was just going to ask Kevin that too. Kind of, do we know yet what the percentages of Catholic schools that you think are going to like stay with a new approach, or stay with some additional online elements, whether they are blended, hybrid, or completely? And secondly, do you think that parents, there's obviously, we keep reading about, I don't know if you've got any scientific data on this yet, Kevin. We keep reading about the number of parents who are driving increases to Catholic schools, right? And who are re-enrolling or enrolling for the first time. Are they doing so because they think they can do better with it, or only because they have a particular kind of approach? So what does it look like, the split, if any, and why the increase?
Sure. I think we don't have any, we actually have research out in the field right now, survey out in the field, to kind of collect especially those parents who've come from a public school system, for example, into a Catholic school, to measure motivations, and then measure also satisfaction, and see how can we, obviously ensure that they stay when kind of things settle back to where things are. As far as where things go, I think everyone is learning. Every single day we're learning more and more. There was a research out yesterday from NWEA. Some of you might have seen it, looking at the gaps. They put a report out in April, and then this was kind of an update to that. They do the MAP test, and so they were looking at data, and some student, what it clearly showed is that some students, and these are students who tend not to be students of color or from lower income backgrounds, so that's a huge caveat to add here, but some students really were pretty flat with regard to their reading scores, right? So they didn't suffer a learning loss there. Now, there were gaps in math that I think probably, but as I see that, I start to speculate and think about what Bruce was just talking about in terms of like the engineered curriculum. I think about for K3, K4, some type of integrated approach where you wouldn't have to necessarily go through a school day like we have a school day. There's what you realize with COVID and with remote learning is how much, and I say this with all respect, how much wasted time there is during a school day. in terms of passing periods and recess and lunch and all of those things that are just normal when you have a large group of people trying to move through a building and try to get things organized. So is there a way to think about integrating curriculum maybe for the lower grades where you have the homework, and this has been clear from research for years, really they should just be reading 30 minutes a night, in the lower grades. They don't need to do a whole heck of a lot of homework. And so start to think about it in terms of that. And then maybe when they get to middle school, high school, you have that engineered curriculum where you're starting to fit in with their specific needs. So in terms of, obviously, I think schools at this point, and we should stress this point, their principals and teachers are stressed right now. It's a very, very challenging time. And I know I've talked to Catholic educators across the country, and they are feeling that stress. Superintendents are feeling that stress. And so I think as far as what it's going to look like afterwards, they're still trying to get through today. And so that's a big piece. But I do think what we're trying to do, obviously, at the national level and with partners in higher education and other partners, is to think through how can we maybe do things differently, because Catholic schools have that mindset of autonomy at their local level and innovation and being creative and meeting with what your community needs are. How can we make some decisions and start to approach things in a way that can incorporate some of these ideas into whether you're in person, hybrid, remote, virtual, all of those different pieces.
It's interesting talking about how the day looks differently. I'm sure most of us have had this experience. I'll walk around my neighborhood during the day and see kids playing outside. I'm like, wow, my gosh, like it's like the old days. There's actually children walking around together, and then they disappear and they go back to their homes. And, if they have people at home, obviously this is the challenge. Our poor and low income kids don't necessarily have that luxury or have that safety, which is why so many micro schools. So let me ask you a question, Bruce, kind of transitioning to this notion of, Catholic schools are stressed, right?
Mhm.
Leaders are stressed. Everyone's stressed out about this. When the charter school movement started, the stress of starting your own school, again, not a comparison to something like COVID, but parents and teachers had schools and they looked very much like small Catholic schools and communities. And they started getting stressed over all the things they had to do. And they started moving towards working with management groups,
Mhm.
CMOs, EMOs, to help provide them the infrastructure, to give them the best practice technology, even to start doing hiring so they could just show up and do what they always wanted to do. Do you see any comparisons or sort of any, similarities in what we're seeing?
Sure. Well, in a way, almost all schools have been forced to build another school in the form of an online school. And whether they've done a good job of that or not, there are a lot of different circumstances that have prevailed from it. But one thing I often say to folks is, look, when you think about online schooling, you have to understand that all the kids are there, all the teachers are there, all the administrators are there, all the processes are there. There's still a registrar process. Everything is there, literally except the physical building and maybe the athletic program. So you just have to imagine all the people are still there and they're all trying to learn and teach and do everything that they used to do, now enabled by a computer system that has a schedule and has curriculum and has lectures and instruction. And instead of a classroom, there's now a virtual classroom. I think that people often underestimate what it takes to get that done until they go and try to do it. And so there are organizations out there that provide the various parts. There are curriculum companies providing electronic curriculum. There are learning management companies providing systems. There are school simulation systems. There are information systems companies, et cetera, et cetera. But until you sew all these parts together and train the teachers and administrators to use them, they don't work very effectively. And then there are companies like ours that provide a turnkey solution to all that stuff that can be of great benefit to a school trying to do this in terms of both time, money, and the quality of what gets done. And I think just like the schools themselves, there are many people on the services industry side trying to figure out how to help the schools better and fulfill their needs more effectively.
Well, and you just mentioned something that's always been a concern and an issue when it comes to online or virtual education, which is training.
Mhm.
I mean, for the longest time, there's not been any schools or hard programs, particularly at the higher education level, that teach teachers how to teach online and blended. And there have been programs who've started up at various universities, and obviously companies and organizations that do this for a living do it. There's more professional development. But Kevin, how do you guys address at NCEA? Do you get like, is that, I would imagine that's a huge part of why you get called for support.
Absolutely. And that's a shift we've actually done as an organization, to be more intentional about our PD, and not only more intentional, but to have this ambition to be, the preeminent provider for online professional development services to Catholic schools across the country. And I feel that that comes with a number of different things that you've already mentioned, and we've already really discussed in different ways. But the fact is there's some benefits to this connectivity we have, and people have speculated on this, but if this pandemic had hit 10 years earlier, pre-Zoom, pre the capacity to really do these video meetings, it would have been so much more devastating, because how you would have thought through those things would have been challenging. I think for us, what we start to see is that we have over 6,000 Catholic schools across the country. How can we start to collaborate and network more intentionally? And I like to say that, every single Catholic educator can feel alone at times, because most of our K-8 schools especially have one class per grade level. So there's one kindergarten, one first grade, one second grade, et cetera. And so you might be a first grade teacher at a small Catholic school, in Florida, and you never see another teacher of first grade your entire year, just because that's not how the networking takes place. So can we use Zoom? We've developed what we call professional learning networks. Can we learn from some of this technology that we've all grown accustomed to and all have become more comfortable with, to network, to collaborate, to obviously ultimately start to improve practice and improve outcomes for kids in the classroom. And I think obviously we're talking about school and classroom and those types of outcomes, but I think there is also a huge piece for adult learners. How do we do leadership formation programs? We just launched this fall, a new Leaders Academy for new principals in Catholic schools. And we have about 25 folks across the country who are participating in that. It's a 5-session over the course of the entire school year that also has a professional learning network component and an hour of executive coaching every time a session takes place. So this idea of really incorporating the technology that we've all come to feel really comfortable with, and how we engage and collaborate and problem solve and network, in our minds, that's going to do nothing but help the outcomes that we see for students in Catholic schools across the country.
But how do you make that happen right in the middle of this crisis, right? So you want to get trained, you want to learn more, but I don't know that many people are taking time to develop themselves professionally or to learn more when this is what they have to go around in circles trying to make sure that they are taking care of the needs of students.
Right. And I think you're absolutely right. And what I would say is, I think we sometimes have in our minds too what the old PD looked like. It was a day, it's 8 hours of training, or you go and you spend 6 hours, and it's kind of a lecture type format. And, from our perspective, we've really tried to think about how do adults, and obviously this can translate to kids, but how do adults learn most effectively? And so we know that Zoom, you can't just sit on a Zoom for 3 or 4 hours. Those of us who have to do that for work every day tend to feel really exhausted at the end of the day. And so how do you take content, deliver content that they need in a focused and streamlined way? How do you give them opportunities to collaborate, talk about it, learn from each other, share what their experiences are? And then how do you also then let them demonstrate what they've learned, demonstrate proficiency, and have an opportunity maybe to offload with a coach or something like that to be able to talk through their own specific needs. What I would say is, I think you're right that there's not a lot of time for people to go to PD, maybe a historical PD or a traditional PD that they might have in mind. What we're finding is that there is a desire and a need for folks to talk to one another, to collaborate, to find out they're not alone, to be able to talk through, this is what I'm doing in my school. I'm doing, remote, or I'm doing hybrid, and so I want to be able to talk to another educator who's in the same boat. And maybe they've got some tools and strategies that they're using that can benefit me. And I have some tools and strategies that I'm using that can benefit them. And that, I think we've seen there is some desire and interest for Catholic educators to participate in that type of learning.
And I wonder if there's not a market opportunity there, right? Not necessarily a business, but a market opportunity for someone to come up and say, here's one really well. There are educators out there, and maybe people who are on this meeting today who've seen it done really well and would love to share, or who haven't seen it done really well and are hungry for that. And as you said, it could be just, let's get together and have a conversation. It could be something that's a little bit more structured. It could involve kids. Bruce, what do you think of that? What's the potential for, again, we're going to, for the next several months at least, what's the potential for helping educators at schools both deploy online technologies, but also learn about it as they go?
Sure. Well, I think it's an enormous need. A lot of the struggles that we're seeing among the schools have more to do with teachers learning to teach in an online circumstance and administrators managing that situation, and then the logistics that they've had to face in terms of going from traditional instructional logistics to now electronic instructional logistics, which are not inconsequential. So, if you were to say what would be the one thing I would wish for this country that would really change things for the better, it would be enlightenment of the teacher and administrators so that they could do their jobs more effectively. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean that is where we can really make a big change and have a lot of success. So if there were professional development programs that were well crafted, efficient, easily delivered, that could help teachers come up that curve, be they Catholic or otherwise, they would be of enormous value. I fear that there are very few organizations who are equipped to even create such programs, and I applaud those who can. So, like Kevin's efforts from NCEA to take that leadership role, there can't be enough of it right now. The need is enormous.
So do you have a great example, Bruce, of schools that you're working with or diocese that are just the park when it comes to sort of their take up of this online education?
We have, we right now we have about 90 different Catholic organizations that we work with, including some very large dioceses around the country, and they vary widely in their preparedness and progressiveness with regard to online learning. Some have seen it coming early, and as last summer got organized and now have thousands of students in a successful online program where we're measuring the results, and the results are as good or better than they were in the face-to-face classroom. But they also committed to large-scale training of their staffs, and they committed to using a system meant for the purpose, and following guidelines and advice from those of us who had been in the industry for a long time, and that succeeded. And then we see all kinds of different models too, where the hybridization continues to occur, and the students come into school part-time. They get their religious instruction from the school, and they take their secular instruction from us, and everything in between. So without getting down into the trees of 90 different instructional models being attempted, the answer is simply yes, that there is a lot going on out there, as Kevin alluded, and a lot of experimentation going on. And the folks who take it seriously and give their people the training that they need are doing well.
Kevin, do you think that a lot of the dioceses around the country that had to close Catholic schools are kind of kicking themselves for doing it since there's a surge in interest, or does that have nothing to do with sort of where we go next?
Well, it's hard to comment on anyone specifically, because I've been a superintendent and I've had to go through that experience, and it's always a painful one. And there are often multiple factors. What we like to say about Catholic schools is I don't think COVID-19 elevated any problems we didn't already know about. I think it probably accelerated some problems. And so we tried to do a little deeper dive, because we did have more Catholic schools close this past year than in probably the last decade or so, to see if it was directly related to COVID. And most superintendents who we surveyed and got information from, and kind of said that these schools were already on the bubble anyway. They were already struggling, and so we're not really quite clear. I'll just share, one thing that I'm thinking a lot about, and I'm almost more concerned about than in the short term, is the medium to longer term. We had the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and yet the largest declines in enrollment, I think, were, and if I'm going off my head here, 2011, 2012, 2013. And so it was a number of years after the actual event where you started to see some impact. Now, we obviously hope that doesn't happen. But we should be prepared to think about what are those longer term impacts, because what we've seen, diocesan offices cutting their operational budgets, which obviously impact the Catholic schools department. Parishes have been shut down for in-person masses, right? So you have less offertory money coming in. And so all of those things can weigh over time. And so obviously being very cognizant of that and being aware of it so that supports can be available to places who need it. But those are things just to be thinking about. And I think it speaks also to what we're talking about, the need to be innovative and creative and not just necessarily get through this and go right back to what you were doing, especially if you weren't particularly satisfied with your enrollment or with your outcomes.
Well, and let's talk about how to be competitive, right? So now there's an enormous opportunity to help support the students in school districts who, thanks to adult interests, have kept schools closed and kids out, and who are not receiving education online. Not to name names, but millions of kids in New York, Boston, Chicago, and so many other places that would probably love the opportunity to sign in to a Catholic online school somewhere. Are schools getting competitive? Are they thinking? And how can we help them think that way if they're not?
Well, I think they're thinking that way. I think it's a huge challenge that you talk about. I mean, we're seeing there's a lot of stuff in New York. Mike Deegan, who's a superintendent in New York for Catholic schools, has an op-ed in the New York Post today with his frustrations about how that process has gone. Again, I was superintendent in Los Angeles, so I know some of the things going on in LA and in California. There are other issues. I do a podcast, and we have a podcast coming out Thursday with Michael Hartney, who's an assistant professor at Boston College, and he did research on this whole idea of reopening schools and whether schools were in person or whether they were virtual. And I mean, the short of his research was that it was political. It wasn't based on health outcomes. It wasn't based on those issues. And he did say, it's a pox on both their houses. This isn't one political position or another, but you'd have places that, again, might be more left, if you will, who even if the infection rates were quite low, they wouldn't want to open their schools. And then you had places that were maybe on the right that had high infection rates and maybe should consider moving to remote, and they didn't. And so I think that's a challenge. And again, I think from a Catholic school perspective, we try to look at these problems and say, how do we solve these problems? How do we fix this? How can we be creative about our solutions? We're not locked into this is the way we have to do things or this is the way we have to approach things. And trying to encourage that more and then be a resource and a support for schools that want to do things differently. I think that's our aim and that's our goal, because we think that will lead to stronger outcomes again for kids over time and then healthier Catholic schools over time.
Well, as much as a supporter I am of great options for all kids and personally of Catholic education, I've always been a bit dismayed that they weren't more competitive. How they can bring in kids and students, which is their mission, and therefore resources, which is business. And so, Bruce, is there a good business opportunity here for schools? And then also, I kind of want you, as a related note, to talk about this issue of cost, because, I would think at first glance, it would probably them be more economical and save some of the money that they are not getting, right, in the offertories and elsewhere by signing up for online education. But then again, online education that's good isn't always necessarily cheaper. So kind of how do you square that? How do you make the case?
Right. So there is an opportunity if schools want to turn the current crisis into an opportunity. If a school decides to bring up a sophisticated online program, It can dramatically broaden the number of courses that it offers to students to literally hundreds from perhaps, dozens before, and enrich the learning experience that way, become a, a larger scale intellectual property deliverer. And also it can change and increase its catchment area, whereas it really only could serve students within a 20-minute drive before. Now it's possible to increase the size of that ring, maybe going out an hour or an hour and a half even, since they don't require the students to be on campus at all, or perhaps only part of the time. Now it becomes practical for more remote folks to attend that school. And some schools are being very aggressive about this and even marketing the programs statewide. So there is what's called a first mover advantage, wherein if a school finally throws in the towel and says, okay, I have to do this, and I'm going to do it right, and I'm going to do it big, they may find themselves with increasing enrollment ultimately over time. On the economic side, online learning doesn't require a physical campus, and therefore some money is saved. It does require teachers, generally in similar ratios. A teacher can really only keep track of about 150 kids before her recency with their knowledge and understanding and even their names starts to break down. And that isn't really any different online than physical. So in the end, you don't save money on teacher instruction. It's the same. So I would say that typically an online system, just to throw numbers around, should be able to instruct at 70% the cost of a brick-based institution as a rough guide to where it should be. So if a school shifts some of its learning to online, it does save some money, and it can also improve utilization of teachers if it's able to increase its student population. It's very hard for a K-12 school to operate below about 400 students. There just aren't enough of them to make the math work. But when you start to get up into 700 or 800 students, then the economics of the school work out better, whether it's a brick school or a click school. Those are, just kind of facts of running a small school. I'm sure those of you on the phone who are school operators would understand. So online learning can help you get to those numbers. It can help you save some of the facilities costs, certainly. And it can help you increase reach and be competitive that way. And it can offer a broader experience to the kids in terms of curriculum. And if you do all of those things in concert, you can take a school that's been struggling with its enrollment for many years and turn it around successfully.
And what about the human capital out there? I mean, are there enough people to be online and teaching?
Sure. And the people are everywhere, right? Now it's all of a sudden the teachers don't all have to be in a particular city. They could be anywhere in the country. You can hybridize the source of the instruction as well as the recipient of the instruction. There's a teacher shortage, yes, but if you're willing to employ teachers in remote parts of the country, if you're willing to employ them on a part-time basis, then you can dramatically increase the pool of available teachers. And we do that as a company. In fact, you can find teachers all over the world. Why not have a French teacher who's in Paris, for example?
That would be great for a lot of people. Kevin, are you finding like when you hear from your colleagues about educators and leaders in the schools, is there interest in like doing more? Do teachers want additional workloads, or are there people who want to come back? I've read a little bit about retired teachers. I mean, what are you hearing about people?
I mean, I think, are you talking about in general, just during COVID and, yeah, in general? I mean, obviously any teacher shortage, and a number of states have teacher shortages, as Bruce alluded to. And I think COVID has exacerbated that in some areas, in some degrees. Catholic schools suffer too, right? Because often what you tend to see is if the public schools tend to have a shortage, then they'll come in and scoop up, the veteran Catholic educators to, get emergency credentials, or if they have credentials, and go to the public school system, which often pays more and has better benefits. So it's a challenge for us. I think in terms of virtual, I think Bruce is right that if you remove the barriers for teaching, you can expand a pool that you can draw from. One example I think I brought up when we were chatting, before this was the book Disrupting Class by Clay Christensen, which came out about 15 years ago. And he talked in that book about the hypothetical Arabic language teacher, where, you know, that you'd have high school, you know, one high school in one area had kids who wanted to learn Arabic, but you didn't have enough kids, you know, to meet a class. But if you all of a sudden move that online, you could easily fill a class, maybe within a district or some region area. And again, Catholic schools, I think what we can start to think about in terms of, if you segment the country into time zones, you know, who are some teachers who are teaching some really creative different courses, and can you make that available to other schools? And again, I'm sensitive to time zones just because even the teacher in Paris, that's going to be a challenge to meet our time zone, right? But if you can somehow align that, can you have a really high quality teacher in what might be a relatively esoteric curricular area, but then you'd obviously have enough students to have interest in that would want to take part in that. So I think there are a lot of strategies, again, I think that are being elevated and realized in terms of what's possible. Your main question, Jeannie, I think there's absolute enthusiasm and excitement about pursuing those things from Catholic school educators. But again, they're in the midst of the challenges right now. So they want, you know, they'd like to see some things fleshed out, I think, a little bit more.
Great opportunity. I want to build, Kevin, on your comment, because when you think about, and I love the time zone framing. We put out a paper about future of school a while ago and talked about the need to just break down barriers. Like, why do we have any barriers? Now, we went beyond private education, but let's just say we stick with Catholic education for a moment. The opportunity to offer that French teacher, the Arabic, to be able to be exposed to like the best history teacher in the entire country and be sitting in rural North Carolina. I mean, the kinds of things that Catholic education can do because they are independent, because they are interested in Catholicism with a small c as well, and opening up kids' horizons. It would be amazing to have them break out of this crisis as the leaders, sort of as the innovative leaders that really drew people to different models that maybe traditional public schools and even charters would follow.
Right. Right. I think you're absolutely right. And I think, I mean, you know, one of the things about the charters too, you were talking about charters earlier. I always like to say Catholic schools were charter schools before charter schools. You know, when there weren't charter schools, that's what the Catholic school tended to be. And so we have as much capacity and as much opportunity to come up with different models, to be innovative, to be creative with how we govern schools, the models we use, the curricular models we use. It's just a willingness to do it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we've got a great question, and Greg, this was not covered. Apologies for it. How are Catholic schools handling music instruction online? I personally like that question. I'm married to a Catholic music educator. What do you guys have to offer on that? Mm-hmm. Any thoughts about music online?
Sure. Well, look, I'll jump in first, Kevin. There's no standard for what they're doing, meaning it's not, in my experience, uniform among the schools. There are online courses to teach music per se in the form of engineered curriculum, but for the most part, the music teachers are attempting to do this using Zoom and other collaboration technologies in a fashion very similar to when they were together. Whether that is the best way to do it or an acceptable or sufficient way to do it, I think it's hard to tell whether the students are continuing to learn at the same pace that they might have done in a face-to-face setting. I think that particular subject is quite difficult to teach that way.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a great question. Oh. Mm-hmm. Well, I was just going to say it's a great question, and don't have any kind of nationwide data, but I have anecdotal data on music teachers who've been very creative in terms of how they've incorporated technology into their lessons. I think one thing I'll share about that is I think it's really important for Catholic schools to focus on music, art, you know, physical education, all of those pieces, because I do feel like coming back to what I was talking about as far as integrated approach to curriculum, I think, you know, sadly, public schools and others sometimes have that testing focus, and you've seen a greater focus and interest in math and language arts and all of those subjects, which is great and wonderful. But I do feel like that well-rounded approach to education is really, really important. So what I would worry about is if there's any diminishment of music instruction or diminishment of art instruction, just because I think it's such a valuable piece of that whole holistic education that students need to receive.
And I think with so many different subject areas and content, there are so many open education resources out there and other kinds of programs. I mean, I just saw something across my desk from the National Italian American Foundation, because I happen to be a member. At 12 o'clock today or something, they were doing an opera. Now, you wonder, they were charging people, but you wonder if you couldn't call them and say, hey, next time you want to do an opera, all my students would be happy to watch. And then you learn about the opera, and then you hear the music, and maybe by the time together there's an assignment. And so I'm telling a lot of the educators, the people in line, things that they already do well, and great educators do that well individually all the time. It's project-based learning, right? And so shifting from all together and synchronistically teaching to project-based and individual just takes some time. And as you're alluding to, Kevin and Bruce, that's hard to do right now, but you can prepare. So let's talk about it. If there's somebody out there who's thinking about, how do I scale the fence into online education, because we want to, how do they begin to look at this as a solution, preparing for the future that's permanent and not response to COVID? What are the steps they would take?
Well, as an educator, I think you can begin with, how do I instruct this child most effectively, and let that guide you, and that will lead you to the best outcome. Put aside the issues of a pandemic and the entrenched interests of a teachers union or whatever it might be that keeps you from changing, and ask yourself, what does the state of the art permit us to do for this child? So, I mean, going back to the music example, there's certain aspects of music instruction that can be taught very well using individualized engineered curriculum for that purpose. And then I think there's inevitably the need for that student to participate in a band of some kind, or an orchestra, or a recital, or what have you, and interact with a teacher who can provide them with the encouragement. So for the most part, most of the subjects that you might teach lead to a hybridized solution of some kind, in which the classroom or the face-to-face experience is used for its highest and best purpose, and the electronic learning environment is used for its highest and best purpose. And over time, subject by subject, those things vary in their intensity and amount. And the way forward is not to eschew one for the other, but figure out how to combine them for the best instructional outcome for the child. And we have lots of research over the decades to suggest what this should be. And I encourage people to go and try to look at some of that, or speak to the experts, rather than try to figure it out for yourself through another 10 years of experimentation. That would be not in the best interests of the child.
No, that'd be awful. Kevin, what do you think?
Sure. And I mean, one of the simple ways I used to frame this out for folks in terms of, we easily can accept the fact when we see a group of first graders walking by that they're different heights, they're different hair colors, different skin colors, different eye colors. They have all these different physical characteristics that we don't even bat an eye at, but somehow we've put them in a box and say their cognitive development has to be online with one another. And then we get into differentiated instruction, which is important. And how do we do all of that? I think again, we can learn out of this. I think online learning is part of this. How do you incorporate different tools into that, is saying we can be more individualized in terms of how we engage every single individual student. So that individual student is getting what he or she needs each and every day to fully actualize their potential. And that, I think, is a huge opportunity. And that's, I think, how we want to think about how we approach any type of innovation or outcome. I used to say too, technology is not an innovation. Like, just putting technology in a classroom is not innovative. You have to start with what's in the best interest of kids. How do you want to ensure they're going to learn? And then once you do that, you can accelerate that through the strategic use of certain technology. But you can't just layer on top technology and think somehow that's going to solve your learning issues or anything like that. So I just think and teachers are doing this and they're seeing this, but I think, again, coming out of this, I think there's huge opportunities to really transform some of our practice that can be more impactful for kids.
No, and layering technology on just a regular school day and saying that that's somehow innovation is what's caused people to go, oh, technology is not good. These kids really need in-person learning, because
Right.
they've not seen the instructional changes that can occur when you're in this environment. I remember taking my first courses online as an adult when I did my master's several years ago, and realizing like, wait, I can't be in Pennsylvania. I can't be there every month. I can only be there once a month. I'm going to be online with these people. I'm paying what? And all of a sudden, it was the most dynamic environment. Some people are super chatty all the time, and some people wanted to be live, and some people just wanted to go back and forth on all sorts of different apps. And I got to know that cohort of people that year better than I think I knew any other class that I'd had probably since being in grade school. So
Mhm.
I remember thinking to myself, oh God, I was suspicious of this too, but it worked. And adults are harder to teach than students, as we know. Pat Hoagie has a question about support for Catholic school leaders. What kinds of support do they need to think about? Do we need to think about the innovation that can happen beyond COVID? What do they need in terms of professional development to help them think beyond it? Again, I think some of this is mindset, right? Are there
Absolutely.
other things that Catholic leaders to be given, to be instructed or led to help them think about innovation beyond COVID?
Sure. And there's lots obviously to that question, and lots to share. But one thing, I'll just point one thing right now. I think we have to think more entrepreneurially as Catholic school leaders. And what I mean by that is, if you are starting a business, you've got to be responsive to community. You've got to be thinking about the future. You've got to look around the corners and try to think about what's going to be needs. You've got to survey your customers, right? I think making sure you are looking at your Catholic school as an opportunity to grow, and approach things in terms of, you're not fixed and kind of anchored to what has always been the case. You can be innovative, you can be different. We have this concept in Catholicism called stewardship, which the simple definition is returning with increase when you're done. And we tell leaders, you are not the owner of this building. You didn't, you didn't go get a small loan and buy a Catholic school. You are a steward. You've been gifted this, and your obligation at the end is to return it with increase. And that increase isn't financial necessarily. It's program, it's growth in enrollment, it's obviously growth in academic outcomes, it's those types of things. And so as a leader, what I would say you really need to be thinking about is just recognizing the fact that you're not, that you can be creative, you can be innovative, you can be asking these questions, doing this research, looking at ways of operation, and being responsive to your community. I think that's really, really important. It's where we have some flexibility. You don't have to do exactly what the other school's doing down the street. You can be more responsive. And so if there's interest in your community to have a music arts program or to have something, you can go ahead and do that and develop that and implement that. So having that mindset, I think, is really, really important for Catholic school educators today.
Mhm.
Bruce, anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think it's valuable for all educators to move on from the notion that the physical building is the school, when I think many people are coming to realize that the school is the collection of students, teachers, administrators, and the curriculum and systems and processes that glue it all together in an instructional experience. The building is just an asset, just like the computer is just an asset. The trick is, what do you do with it? And the amount of building is now subject to question based on everyone's recent experience. And I think in the long run, that may turn out to be very good. And I challenge everybody to adapt as necessary, learn, take the best of what they learn, and continue to do it into the future. And do not be afraid.
Terrific. Final question. If more and more Catholic schools are non-Catholic, Catholic schools for discipline, true, safety, maybe better education, how does that translate to remote learning over the longer term? In other words, if you're showing up, I guess, Bill, you're saying, because you want to be in a building where there's discipline, safety, and some of those other things, does remote learning then take away that group of students?
Well, potentially, again, whatever their motivations are to be there, what you know, what we're very proud of in Catholic schools is that we do not exclude non-Catholics, right? And we have Catholic schools that have significant percentages of non-Catholic students. The little simple thing I like to share, a colleague shared with me years ago, and it's just stuck with me, is we don't mind if you're not Catholic, if you don't mind that we are. And what that simply means is it's a mindset for us in how we frame our education. It's how we frame all subjects. It's kind of that secret sauce regarding community and building connections. And if you want to be a part of that, we're more than happy to have you be a part of that, regardless of your faith background, regardless if you don't have a faith background. But we also want to make sure our Catholic schools recognize that the Catholic piece is important. We don't want to diminish that. So I think, and again, not kind of getting the total essence of what Bill's question is, I think if you live that culture and you really have that mindset within your community, that'll come through in some virtual ways too. It doesn't have to necessarily be in a brick and mortar building. You can have some of those positive outcomes even in a virtual environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, kindness and compassion and the things you talk about also sometimes drive the content why so many families want to send their kids to Catholic schools. I think. Bruce, last word.
Yeah, I think all of that's true. I happen to be not Catholic, but did attend a Catholic undergraduate institution, and I think I'm the better for it. No, and in at the absence of that, I would not have studied philosophy and ethics and a half dozen other things that I was required to take at that school. And I speak and have spoken very positively about my undergraduate experience that way. I think it's important for Catholic schools not to lose their identity just because the classroom versus click room is causing some disruption. The school is not the computer and it's not the building. It's the instructional experience and value system that are delivered to the students by a group of people who are dedicated philosophically to a way of learning and perhaps a way of life. It would be very sad to me if somehow that gets lost in this recent shuffle.
Well, on that note, I so appreciate you both, Kevin Baxter, NCEA, Bruce Davis with Catholic Virtual and Hudson Global, for being part of this conversation. I'll both, as well as everybody who's participating, to rather than do what people who are in and around Catholic education always do, which is be very local and decentralized, is let's come up with those breakout models for how to solve the most pernicious problems, because you can do it without having to fight a system. And let's show the rest of the world how it's done. Great. So on that, thanks for joining us, and wish you all a great day. Let's keep the conversation and the efforts going.
Okay,
Thanks, Jeannie. Thanks,
Thank you.
Bruce.
Thanks, Kevin.